Hello and a warm welcome to the special CNBC Africa debate coming to you live from the city of Durban on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum on Africa, which is currently in session. My name is Gugulethu Cela, and today we gathered to discuss how we can re-engineer Africa's infrastructure potential through unlocking capital, seeking further partnerships, and of course, this aiding us in achieving inclusive economic growth through responsive and responsible leadership as aligned with the theme for this year's WEF Africa conference. Now, no doubt, it will be a fulfilling conversation over the next hour, and you too at home can participate with us on social media. Be sure to include the @CNBC Africa account name and the hashtag WEF Africa on 410. I'm joined, though, by a high-level panel to give us details with regard to how we can see a tangible difference regarding infrastructure development on the continent and expediting the process as we know of the shortfall that we have in Africa. Joining me, starting towards my closest on my right, is Joe Kaiser, President and CEO of Siemens.
Morning.
Dr. Martin Davies, who's the MD of Emerging Markets in Africa at Deloitte. Kanan Lakmiharan, Partner and Head of Infrastructure Practice at McKinsey & Company, and Busi Mabuza, Board Chairperson at the Industrial Development Corporation. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for joining us today. Now, we're not alone, certainly joined by a wonderful audience who will also be participating through a question and answer session in the second half of the conversation today. Naturally, when it comes to infrastructure, it's no doubt that on the African continent we know that there's a shortfall of developments as we have been left behind with regard to the level of infrastructure development that takes place. I want us to start off the conversation by tying it in to the overview regarding the World Economic Forum theme for this year, how we can attain inclusive growth through infrastructure development. Joe, I'd like to start off by getting your opening comments regarding this theme.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I mean, if you talk about inclusive growth and the challenges we have, I think we just start with the opportunities first. There's about 1 billion people on the continent, and only about 33% have electrical power. So if you want to bring this continent and those many, many young people to where they deserve to be, we need to get started with the development of power generation. So everyone needs to have reliable, affordable, and sustainable electrical power. I think that's the first one we need to go look at. Second topic is infrastructure. That means moving people and goods, very important. And then the industrialization will come because, you know, everyone will build on a very sustainable and reliable infrastructure. Alongside with that, industrialization only happens if we can have and train people to help us then get the job done. So training, education needs to go alongside with the build-out of the infrastructure in electricity and mobility and the like. So I think that's the challenge, that's the opportunity. And if you look at the WEF here in Africa, it's a perfect opportunity to get things started. I'm very proud, I have to say, very proud that the German government was sending Mr. Schäuble, our finance minister, and also Brigitte Zypries, Secretary of Economic Development, because it is not just about talking, it is about really showing people that you're serious. Mm-hmm. And our Chancellor is going to make Africa and the development of this continent the #1 priority at the G20 in Hamburg this year. Mm. And that's, I guess, something where we need to really push hard and help the continent to develop. And typically, you don't go there and tell what needs to be done. You better go there and listen what can be done, you know, what people want, how governments can support to put the framework together so that the private sector can act. So I'm not only hopeful, I'm actually really excited about the opportunity. That's why I also wanted to be here and not just send greetings via Twitter, because it's important that you show your commitment. As of yesterday, we said that Siemens will commit €1 billion for economic development projects. So we will finance and build those projects. We can be really fast, although we are a big company. We built the three biggest power plants ever built in the world in 18 months in Egypt, and that can be done in any country, anywhere in Africa.
I hope that we certainly get to that objective, which is what we want to get out at the end of this conversation today in the next hour. But as you've mentioned capital, you've mentioned speed, you've mentioned partnerships, which is also quite critical. And those seem to be, and education, yes, and skills and development. And we'll certainly unpack each of these in their individual capacities. But Martin, you've obviously got very bold views as well with regard to the shortfalls. Yes, there are some threats and concerns, but of course opportunities, as have been highlighted by Joe. But from your perspective with regard to setting the context for today's conversation, we know that there's a significant shortfall. Are we tapping into each of these avenues as highlighted by Joe enough?
Good, thank you. As Joe so correctly said, the demand side is obvious from a demographic perspective, from an under-serviceability of both hard and infrastructure on the continent. And secondly, the willingness to supply and build the infrastructure undoubtedly is there. So of course we can go into the sort of more micro challenges of why this does not naturally take place. But in put in context, and learning from Germany, if I may, in 1989, end of 89, I found myself in Berlin. I was a youngster, still am.
Of course.
And it was a crazy place to be. The Berlin Wall had come down, literally. The sort of Comic-Con, Eastern Europe was the traditional socialist closed economies. Eastern Europe were closing, and what was Eastern Europe became emerging Europe, and Germany became one. Point I want to make is at that exact time, in a few short years afterwards, that political shock resulted in deep structural reforms in that economy. Structural reforms that created market opening for private capital, which went into infrastructure, largely into Eastern Europe. Exactly the same thing happened. I'm not sure if this is a good omen or a bad one. I was living in South Korea in 97, 98, Asian financial crisis. And we saw from Indonesia up to Seoul, the financial crisis, a financial shock, resulted in market opening and structural reforms. And again, private capital opportunities presented themselves. In our context in Africa, since Q4 2012, on the solid commodity front, from July 2014, on the oil price shock, if you will, we've had a commodity shock. Eastern Europe had the political shock, Asia had a financial shock, we've had a commodity shock. And now we see from Egypt, as you mentioned, Joe, to Mozambique, to Ghana, is subsequent fiscal blowouts in these countries, amongst others, is now creating privatization opportunities in the pursuit of good fiscal governance and management. This creates new opportunity for infrastructure investors and operators in what were traditionally very closed, state-owned infrastructure markets. For me, that's the macro trend here. And we're seeing this prying open, if you will, post-crisis, let's call it structure reform, that's creating opportunities for private capital in traditionally it was only the domain of the state. That's the lesson from Eastern Europe, from Asia, as I understand it, and now emerging increasingly in gathering momentum in our own continent.
You mentioned something so critical there, which is obviously unleashing the potential for private capital. But on the continent, what we've seen is that a lot of the time government funding or DFIs have played a critical role when it comes to infrastructure projects. I definitely want to come to you, Canon, to get an overview as to how we need to attain that 70% mark of infrastructure development through GDP in ensuring that there's efficient planning and that the private sector feels comfortable enough to actually be involved in participating here.
Yeah. So I agree with Joe and Martin that the critical, to unleash Africa's kind of potential, we need to focus on infrastructure and education, no doubt. And I think we also have to think about how do we bring the vulnerable into and give them economic opportunities. Here I'm talking mainly about women. And as long as we don't give them access to opportunity, economic opportunity, we're losing half the labor force. Also, I think the other important part is that we have we're going to have as Africa the biggest labor pool, bigger than China, bigger than India. We're going to be the biggest market. We've got the dividend, demographic dividend. So this is not about a handout to Africa. This is about the next big market as well. So I think we're going to look at it in that way, the next growth engine. Then shifting to what I think is the opportunity, just building again in the comments, our work says that in order to kind of get to that 70% of GDP stock level, we think the gap or the spending needs to increase to about $150 billion a year by 2025. We're about 80, we think. And that's just on hard infrastructure, forget the social, soft. At the moment, government and DFIs are providing about 80% of that investment. Chinese funding about 15, and the private sector about 10. So there's a huge potential to scale up private sector financing. And if you look at the trend of where the money is, where the spending is going over the next 10 years, we think there's still a gap of about $30 to $40 billion a year that has to come from somewhere, either from China, either from private sector financing, because the DFIs and the MDBs and governments will reach some limits. So I think that's the kind of, if you wanted to put a problem, and you can argue about whether it's 2 billion here, but that's the scale of, I think, the challenge and the opportunity in my view. So let's just to put that number out there. And I think for inclusive growth, what we've got to think about is where can government focus on the soft and the hard infrastructure where no one else can do it, and leave the rest to the private sector and create the enabling environment for them to come in and to partner with them. I think that's what we've got to figure out. There's a temptation for governments and the public sector to go after the easy, the quick wins, to show results. But we've got to figure out how to resist the temptation and go for the harder stuff and create the market for the private sector to come in the, if you will, the more commercially viable sectors.
Exactly. Busi, certainly want to get your feedback on the IDC, certainly going in for the kill and not necessarily trying to attempt at easy wins only, but also improving the participation of the private sector in these developments to attain inclusive growth.
Absolutely, and the difficulty that I have is where government seems to be in, or deemed to be in competition with the private sector. I think the better models are where government is working lock in step with the private sector. I don't think that there should be carve-outs in terms of where the private sector is playing in, privatization is great, where the opportunity presents itself. But I think there is opportunity on an ongoing basis for the government to crowd in through creating the conducive environment, the billions of dollars and euros that the private sector has available. If I may just touch on the gap that we have, or from an inclusive growth and inclusive economy basis, we have infrastructure in some instances, for example, on the social side. Healthcare in South Africa is an example, where we have infrastructure that is underutilized, and infrastructure in certain segments of the population that is bursting at the seams, that can't manage to cope with the demand. I think there is an opportunity there for better utilization of existing infrastructure. It's important that we maintain the infrastructure that we have. In South Africa, I think we're waking up to the fact that in instances, we don't pay enough attention to the maintenance of the infrastructure. And therefore, as we try to address the existing gap that Martin was talking about, there's a new gap that is coming along. We need to continually watch all of that and make sure that we're funding maintenance, we are funding correct utilization, optimal utilization of infrastructure, and that the private sector and the public sector are working lock in hand to unravel this conundrum.
Exactly. I'd like us to pick up on a few themes that have certainly come through here. We're hearing quite a bit about partnerships. We know that it also starts with policies together with unlocking the capital and really expediting the process. And that's where I want us to hopefully get some outcomes on here. We know that there are long lead times when it comes to project preparations before we do see commercial partners come in order to see the uptick of these projects. When it comes to partnerships and innovations that we see coming along, are there best practice examples that we can allude to? Because the Chinese have also come in, making a significant progress. Siemens, you just recently announced a partnership with the government in Uganda as well as Sudan. So clearly there are some elements and policies that have been provided that have boosted your levels of confidence. And of course, capital. There's quite a bit of money out there. Just yesterday we had a conversation on blended finance, and the opportunities do exist in order to unlock and expedite the processes that come through here. Canon, let's start off with you, getting your views on some of these pointers, and it's an open question to the panel.
Sure. I think the first thing is we probably, if you go back over the last 5-10 years, this issue has come up so many times. Everyone talks about the infrastructure paradox, where there's a need, clearly, as we've all talked about, and seemingly a lot of money out there. Our estimate is, if you just look at the assets under management, look at what's in infrastructure and what could be deployed to Africa, there's about $500, $600 billion just waiting there right now. Why can't we get them to match? We talk about the necessity of planning, project prep, getting the risk profile right, and then you start to marry that. I think we've all talked about that many times, and why we're not solving it. So I'm a bit frustrated sometimes about that. And I think we need to say, okay, fine, let's do some incremental stuff. But I think we also have to say, can we figure out how to do something bold?
And is there a silver bullet solution here?
There's no
Probably
silver
not.
bullet. In my view, there's no silver bullet. And it's a combination of things. And that's why it's good to hear what Germany is doing, for example, putting it front and center, because I think that's what's needed. For example, I mean, one of the big things, and then we can go down to maybe some smaller things, something like when we had a focus on vaccinations or AIDS, where we're a global alliance that comes together. So think about that for Africa, where we say, here's a global alliance, infrastructure, focus on infrastructure. We create a capital pool with reasonable rates because it's blended. We say to governments, you can get this, but we need certain things put in place around governance, around a good planning facility, independent maybe of cycles, election cycles. So you think about your plan, give it in there. In return, and then put in place regulations, governance. In return, there's some conditionality around, we will give you some resources to help with planning, prep, reducing risk profiles, executing. You need to figure out how to reallocate your fiscal, your budget to the infrastructure that needs it. How do you strengthen revenue streams? How do you put in place good governance? And then we choose a few countries that we go deep in. Because sometimes some countries feel they don't need it. Fine, okay. But let's choose the countries that are prepared to go deep. They're in the transition from agri-based to kind of manufacturing or somewhere in between. And they're prepared to work hand in hand with this. And let's show some good examples rather than waiting for everyone to come on board.
Are there good examples that you can allude to?
I think sometimes when you really hit rock bottom, when you're facing a challenge, that's when you're ready to do something different, as Martin said, right? So think about, I don't want to mention the countries, but because in case it's seen, but I think the 3 or 4 countries, population of between 30 to 40, 50 million people, ready, who are going through this transition, I think which are not too big, but are ready to do something like this. And I think we should figure out how to do that and show some great examples of change.
Martin, I think you've got interesting insights as well with regard to lessons that we could learn from some of our peers in more developed economies regarding some of the models that they've also implemented here, building up on the themes that Canon has highlighted.
Okay, certainly. I think, infrastructure, but towards what end? Of course, development, but there's a step missing. And it's been a key theme, it always is a key theme of the World Economic Forum on Africa, and rightfully so, and that's industrialization/diversification. Ultimately, infrastructure is very deflationary. And one of the biggest challenge of the industrialization, or in many cases reindustrialization of numerous African countries, is the lack of infrastructure, which is very inflationary on production costs and distribution costs. How do you build an export-driven economy when your infrastructure is so dysfunctional? And this has been the lesson from, practically every successful exporting country in recent economic history. I think the second point is that there's no, and building on from, let's say you start to build a level of acceptable, efficient, well-maintained infrastructure. Beyond that is there's no sector like manufacturing upon which can be built on infrastructure that diffuses wealth through a economy, a society like manufacturing. Resources, extractive industries, I would argue, have the opposite effect. And we talk about inclusion, a buzz phrase these days, inclusive growth. You cannot have inclusion, I would argue, with very few exceptions, maybe if you're Scandinavian perhaps, but you cannot have inclusion without a diversified economy and a manufacturing-based economy. And this is only possible with the rollout of big infrastructure and, most importantly, efficient infrastructure. So these are not compartmentalized or siloed conversations, industrialization, infrastructure, social inclusion.
True.
For me, it's one and the same thing. And the ultimate thing, and this is another story perhaps, but the poor people in Africa, unfortunately most Africans are poor, unfortunately, often through no fault of their own, is they're locked into low productivity jobs. Infrastructure will provide the necessary public goods, public services, and network accessibility that low productive jobs and people can start to plug into and raise productivity. Inclusive growth is a productivity challenge, and I think that's a very crucial conversation.
are we getting it right then by ensuring that we're investing in infrastructure projects that are future-proofed, so to speak? We talk about this age of the fourth industrial revolution, as well as digitalization, and I know hard infrastructure certainly does aid that, but are we also preparing ourselves not only for the fundamental needs of infrastructure right now, but also future developments? Joe, Wusi, share your views here.
Well, I agree with you. There's got to be infrastructure and the plan how to industrialize a country. I also agree with you that there's got to be going together between the government and the private sector, hand in hand. Government needs to set the framework, and then someone needs to get it done. So that's the theory. So
Practical's a lot harder, right?
Which is always good. So talking about it is always easy, but doing it is sometimes a bit different. I believe, and coming to your point on the fourth industrial revolution and digitization, don't try to grab the stars if you don't exactly know where they are. It is not going to be good. It is important to have a vision. It is great to have something you want to strive for, but there is no fourth industrial revolution on the continent yet if you don't fix the basics, because one builds on the other. Mm-hmm. We've got to have the physical layer of production first. And there is a huge opportunity for that, because once we build infrastructure case by case, I would not go out and say Africa as a continent needs infrastructure. Okay, sure, we know that for quite some time. We've got to go very specific. Ivory Coast or Ghana or Sudan or any country needs to make a plan. And the plan could be, we provide, again, electricity, because if you don't have electricity, there is no manufacturing, really, honestly. And then comes the question, how then do we go from infrastructure to production? That's very complicated. And what you typically look at is, what do you have already? And build on what you have. Now, if you look at Africa, what do we have already? A very, very actually powerful agriculture sector, right? For example, or minerals, the mining sector, what's called commodity at times. So I think we need to go look, how can we build on those agriculture? How can we build on minerals and go up, move up the value chain? Means, don't just harvest sugarcane and export it to someplace else, extracting the sugar. Bring production here, extend the value chain to not just exporting the groceries at a very low price and someone else does the canning. Now do the canning here, or maybe even build the chocolate bar here and then export it to also. Go up the value chain from what we have and then develop it from there. Because you just start something out of the blue, very hard to deal with the logistics and the value chain. And then once we've built the production sector, after the infrastructure, then we can go after the stars. What do we do with software? How do we make manufacturing, which might be on a admittedly lower level, how can we enhance it then through automation? Or how can we enhance it then to bring IT and software in capabilities? But then again, make sure if you go after this that you have resources to get it done. So it's a very, very fragile process to develop this value chain up. So I really would think, let's go one at a time and don't just try to do everything at the same time, because that is actually set up for failure. That means there's more frustration because, again, it hasn't worked, right? And then we are back to square one. So I would really look at get the infrastructure done together with governments, and I would really say this is something where reasonable people need to go and do something. Is that a silver bullet? Well, yes. We just need to find it. And one silver bullet is that we go together and say, this is what we are going to build. No one in between, no agents, no systems integrators, no advisors. Reasonable people come together and say, what do you need and how can we get it done? B2G. When I was in Egypt negotiating those power plants, the president said, you come here, I want to negotiate with you. I've never negotiated the power plant as a president of a country. But the point was,
Just to put that in context, was that the first time you negotiated with the president in Africa or globally?
Globally, because typically you bring your case and then he or she sends you to a minister or to a utility or something else. He said, look, I want you to build this in 18 months and I need $2 billion less from your offer because our people need it. Well, easier said than done. But then we did a handshake. And I said, okay, fine, I'm going to get it done. And we didn't have a single piece of paper or contracts or financing or lawyers, all that stuff. We did it. We are basically finished now when we built the power plant. It's almost ready. And you're still not fully done with the paper. Because at some point in time, you just need to believe something and get it done. And we did get it done. And this is the type of leadership, which I believe is the silver bullet. The silver bullet is leadership. Responsible people getting something done together no matter what. And this is the type of stuff, then you get your people on your side because they believe you what they see. And I think this is the topic along leadership, is the silver bullet.
Leadership. Wusi, do you agree?
Absolutely agree. And I think the youth will have to play an increasing role. And which is why it's so important that we have the education and the skills to ensure that the leadership is able to take us there. I'd just like to build on that industrial development capacity issue. In a continent where we have so much oil and gas, how much refining capacity do we have onshore? It's a travesty. If there was a young entrepreneur yesterday who was talking about cashew nuts that are produced in Tanzania, which were being exported, I think, to another country to be processed and unsold to the US. He saw that opportunity and put a processing plant in Tanzania. That is what we need to do and without the hard infrastructure, without the new infrastructures, I worry that we shouldn't miss the new opportunities. Telecommunications opened up a whole new world for Africa, where we didn't have the fixed line infrastructure, but we are almost as connected, except for the data costs and the speeds, as where the rest of the world is, and we'll probably, catch up with the rest of the world quite quickly. I wonder about other new technologies. Is there an opportunity in drone technology? I do not know. I think the young people who are technically minded and skilled need to step up to the plate and provide the leadership that's needed to unlock this manufacturing and industrial capacity that's going to see our people gainfully engaged in the economy.
Exactly. Kenneth, you wanted to add something there?
I think going back also the kind of the fourth industrial revolution as we talk about it, I think what it does offer though, and I agree with Joe that you've got to build the kind of physical layer, the hard, it is undoubtedly the case. What it does offer us though is two things. I think the first one is it offers us an opportunity to kind of fast track education skills, vocational training. We can do, you can do like virtual learning and skills development, drawing on a wider pool of resources, not just in your country, and fast track that. And I think the second thing it allows us to do is to figure out how to better utilize and build infrastructure. So existing infrastructure where, find out what are the patterns of usage, get that done, probably shift to more predictive maintenance so we don't waste money on unnecessary maintenance, and figure out how to cut the cost of construction based on where we are. And I think we think there's opportunities of 20 to 45% saving in Africa,
which
based on historical spending, benchmarks, and so on. So I think that's where we can use kind of the fourth industrial revolution to help us leapfrog in certain areas. And we've done it already. We've showed what we've done in telecoms, in financial inclusion, and so on. So I think we already know there's some DNA already, and we just need to figure out how to now just unleash it a bit more.
Exactly. Clearly increasing the value chain, ensuring that there's sufficient investment across the board, and partnerships and appropriate leadership is what has come through. We will take a quick ad break for the moment, but when we return, we take a look at further opportunities that exist in re-engineering Africa's infrastructure development, and of course, get some engagement and questions from our audience members. We'll be back right after this. Questions, sir, and come to gentlemen. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special, where we're discussing infrastructure on the African continent and really leveraging off of the opportunities that exist here in unlocking infrastructure development and capital deployment. We continue with our conversation, and just before the ad break, we had set the tone regarding leadership, appropriate skills development, increased partnerships, and of course getting the private sector to invest a lot more actively in the infrastructure development programs that we have on the continent. But we're going to get some perspective from our audience members now to give us their views and questions to the panel. We do have 2 questions we've identified. If you could please stand up and introduce yourself, sir, and pose your question to the panel.
Good morning to one and all, and to the esteemed panel. I'm Vishal Maharaj, and I'm CEO of Megazone Radio, which is an online streaming station, which obviously has an international footprint. Now, with South Africa's infrastructure, we're barely getting there to be able to provide that kind of streaming audio to the less fortunate. 2 things I need to find out is, firstly, how do we unlock funding to be able to get the radio station available to the less fortunate, firstly, and secondly, we talk about employment, increasing employment. How is it that we are able to have our companies as SMMEs fall within a different bracket from that of corporates, where we have a completely or different, or maybe a slightly less enforced ruling with regard to employment as we start and we're able to get funding in place, or lack of funding in place, it results in the business either being able to function or not function. But we are still subjected to the same stringent regulations with regard to employment, and it creates a problem for us as SMMEs now to employ somebody, knowing that 3 months down the line, if the project doesn't work out, we now have to be dragged through the entire rigmarole of CCMA inquiries and investigations. But this all comes back to the fact of unlocking funding for technology across South Africa, more importantly. I just want to know what's the input from the esteemed panel with regard to moving forward with creating job by unlocking funding for SMMEs with regard to streaming technology.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your question, Vishal. We'll take your question, sir.
Good morning to the panel. My name is Richard Fries. I'm the CEO of GIP. We're the largest South African-owned engineering consulting firm operating from South Africa throughout Africa. My question is about mindset. There's too much agreement between our panel members there, so we've got to get them to share their views a little bit. The point that was made was there was a nice split given on how much government is spending when it comes to infrastructure. I think 80% of the current capital spent that we sort of see throughout the continent is public sector spend. So the question about the low-hanging fruits, and the point was made that we tend to go for the low-hanging fruits as government. But what my experience is that government actually tends to take on the difficult projects. Projects like your Kuga, as an example, would not have happened if government didn't invest there. Projects like your Gautrain would have not happened if government didn't invest there. You can look at airports and so on. There's always an argument about financial returns, whereas public sector looked at cost benefit to society. So if we see where we see the huge programs like your independent power producer program in South Africa, these are payback periods of 7 to 10 years, and then the private sector is out of there. So they're lucrative. They come in billions of rands and spend there. But the problems that we're facing, a lot of it has got to do with the financial viability around those projects. So my question to the panel is the mindset from private sector, both the financiers, the developers and so on, correct if we are going to solve this problem? If we keep looking at the financial returns that we expect, the low-hanging fruits, they run out very, very quickly. We're now getting to that point where we've got to do the hard stuff, and is the mindset the right one?
Solid question. Thank you so much for your question there, Richard. Perhaps let's start with that one, hard-hitting, and Busi, you can respond to that, and feel free to the other panelists to give your feedback. Mindset.
If I may start, and I'll start with the latter question and come back to the earlier question. I'll park mindset because that's something different. I would like to talk about whether we as the public sector, and I'm from a DFI, are talking to the private sector and finding the opportunities that are appropriate for each one of us. So we may have regulated capital that is out there that either because of banking regulation requirements or pension fund requirements cannot take the long tenure. Then we as development finance institutions should be able to come in and create those instruments and those financing solutions that unlock the opportunities. So that is why it is so important for the private sector and the public sector to talk to each other rather than try and second guess whether government is in the right, has the right mindset or the private sector has the right mindset. It's fantastic that there is capital that's available, and I would agree with the gentleman that in my view, the government sector and the development finance institutions have actually gone for the more difficult opportunities. We tend to have a higher risk appetite. We play at the very early stage. Maybe we don't allocate enough capital because we are still on a learning curve and we may not be understanding the opportunity. But as soon as we see the opportunity, we are there. We are available for the long-term projects. And therefore, if the private sector sat there in the middle and we're able to exit, leaving government in those projects, then we'd be able to unlock. In terms of the opportunities for small and medium enterprises, I would suggest that entities such as the Department of Trade and Industry, the Industrial Development Corporation, and a number of its subsidiaries, there's a small enterprise financing agency, there's the National Empowerment Fund. Those are entities where I would start to inquire before going out and looking for capital. And by the way, if I may just indicate that the IDC has a Pan-African mandate. So we're looking for opportunities across the board. We focus on industrial development, but where infrastructure unlocks the industrial development opportunities, would definitely be there as partners to the private sector. Is that the new
markets model or funding that's available for some of these new industries that clearly are developing across the continent? I do want us to keep with the tone that Richard asked regarding mindset, because it's quite critical as well. Just how much risk needs to be mitigated before the private sector actively participates in some of the larger projects?
Yeah. Well, so I think, you can't force people to do things. You have to figure out how to have a conversation and create the environment, and you'll find a range of participation there. So I think it's hard to say everyone's going to have the same mindset. I think there is a perception that the private sector will only stay in this much. They're looking for the maximum profit and so on. And generally, everyone's trying to figure out what's the return.
Sure,
but I think if you have a conversation with many people, and I'm sure Joe is probably from the private sector, you'll say, if you have the right conversation and you say, hey, what will make this work is a 10-year, staying here for 10 years or 15 years. Here's how we'll help you with the risk. Can you mitigate? I think that's, you've got to figure out how to do it, and that's where the leadership comes in, right? And I think there's enough appetite for the private, then the private sector will bring the funds in. And I think there are examples already on the African continent where those conversations have led to deals. I think we're just not having enough of those. There's leadership that's needed to do that. And I think it can happen. I think we've got to be careful also to say that I think if you even think about where public sector goes after the more risky and long-term opportunities, I think even there's opportunities for partnerships with the private sector. So for example, in the operations and maintenance, So how do you create an environment where you create effective building and operations and maintenance of that asset, while the public sector figures out how to support the financing, and then over time crowds in private sector financing because they've managed the risk down. So how do you figure out how the government can exit and then spend that money on a new set of risky projects? True. So I think there's a lot of that stuff that needs to become happen, and you have to become creative, and that creates new pools of capital and opportunity.
Martin, then we'll come to you, Joe.
Just picking up on Richard Friss's comments, and I share frustration, but let me take it one step further. It's very ironic that we have such deep capital markets in South Africa, fantastic asset management industry, and undoubtedly private capital is investing in infrastructure. Look at shopping malls. Look at the new Sandton CBD. The previous Johannesburg CBD was built by private money. But the question is that, I think when it comes to, is private money investing in the right infrastructure? And to that, I think linking infrastructure, more sort of think rail particularly, for infrastructure around connectivity is far more complex and is more the responsibility, arguably, from a state sector to initiate it, but certainly to bring in private capital. The second point I want to make, and both Busi Karan has mentioned crowding in. I want to use the opposite phrase, crowding out. State ownership crowds out, and state monopolistic practices crowds out private sector, private capital participation. So when we have arguably obsolete structures, ownership structures of key bottleneck state enterprises in infrastructure, that's preventing private capital from moving into those industries and sectors. I think the third point is what Busi referred to. It's one of political economy, and this is the complexity. It comes down to how does the state interact with private capital to effectively forge a PPP model and get it done. So I think these are very sort of complex issues, and it comes back to sort of what is the vision effectively of leadership to make this happen, to drive it through. I'm pretty sure that private capital would invest if that confidence, and again, the state's responsibility is to create the environment conducive to inspire, to create confidence, to invest in whatever sector. So let's create the confidence through having conversations.
Exactly. We'll go to the audience to get a second round of questions in just a moment, but Joe, certainly you need to add your voice to the conversation and responses. We'll come back to you, Kanan, very briefly too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is about exactly what has been said. The government needs to set the framework. Yeah, in many ways, also in infrastructure. Of course, the law setting. And then once the framework is set, then the private sector can move in. And then I said leadership earlier. It's also about government leadership. I mean, the point is, you have to have a plan how you develop your country. There is just as I said, I just came back from the Middle East. There is in Saudi Arabia, there is this Vision 2030. In the UAE, long time ago, Dubai has been starting out, with the question, well, actually, what happens after the time of oil? China's got, China 2025. India's got Make in India. So everyone's got a strategic concept on how to develop their country.
Some might say other African states have them too, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya as well.
Absolutely.
So quite a few plans, but implementation again is where we do fall short.
That's the first thing. You've got to have a plan on how to get there, right? And then we would look into what framework does it take to attract the private sector to get something done. And then we need to be very, very specific. What exactly is it? Who can do it? What does it take? And what will be the desired outcome? Very specific, from the vision down to execution. This will be a very stringent process. I'm going to pick up on two topics maybe from the audience. One was, well, public spending is already 80%, so why would you even suggest to spend more? Well, it depends on what nature government and public spending is. And this is what we see a lot all over the world. If government spending, public spending is about consumption, like welfare, you get the money and it somehow goes away. There is no investive spending. If you have investive spending, this is something which you can build on. 72% of the global GDP is manufacturing. So if you continue to do consumptive spending, doesn't go anywhere because people take the money, do something with it, and it's over. doesn't create jobs, doesn't do anything. So there's got to be the shift from consumptive to investive spending. The second topic, and this is really something I'm really into it, this, there is this small, medium enterprises here, family business, and there's these big corporations there, and it's got nothing to do with each other. It's a widespread belief, and it couldn't be more wrong than you can potentially think. And I give you an example. Again, Egypt, because it's always good to talk about experience. When we did those mega projects, 8 billion in orders, which was good for us, and then then the German government, which has needed to kind of guarantee the political risk and this and that, said, oh yeah, well, but small, medium enterprises, they don't have a thing in it. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is today, we've got 24,000 people on site to build it. We brought 163 German small and medium enterprises with us. They would never have been able to go there on their own. Just forget about it. They wouldn't even know how to get started, the visa and everything. Mm-hmm. So the big lighthouse projects bring along small and medium. So the question would be then, where does that leave the local players, right? Even more importantly. And you would be surprised to hear that more than 70 small and medium companies in Egypt have been selected from us for the supply chain, 70. Well, most of them didn't have a clue on how to do it, but we brought our people and helped them along. Okay. And now they are there, they know what to do, and they can do any project anywhere in the country or in Africa, which is, kind of. So that's the way. You've got to have these lighthouse projects, big, infrastructure-based, bring the small, medium along, train them on the job, True. And then they are there and know what to do. Exactly. So I'm honestly not that pessimistic. It can be done. It needs a plan, with a very clear execution, close cooperation between the public sector and the private sector to get infrastructure done, and then we will build on industrialization.
An optimist on African development, quite clearly you are.
I'm not an optimist. I just believe that the world has a responsibility, really has, to get one of the biggest continents in the world with 1 million people to a place where there is hope. There is a place where there is hope. It's a cup of good hope, right?
Exactly.
You can't just say, well, we are the world, we move on, and there's this huge continent of so many young people, and let's see what they do. And if there's an opportunity, I come. If there is not, I go. You can't do this. Because, not just out of humanity, if we continue to leave the continent alone and move on with all the power of organized public sector with private capital going to the US or wherever, or China or India, what happens? The best talent of this continent, young people, they all go someplace else. Mm-hmm. And that's just not what we should do.
Precisely. We are slightly under pressure for time. I just want to check if there's one more question from the audience that we get feedback. We'll take your question, ma'am, and responses from the panelists as we start drawing up our closing remarks.
Hello, hi. I am Violeta Dubese from Thomson Reuters, and I think I'll just leapfrog on the young people that you're speaking of, and I wish there were a lot more young people in this room. But Mambusi spoke about, technology and them being the innovators and the technologists. I just wanted to know from a government perspective, and I think if corporate is also just very intentional on that, what the agenda and the strategy is to source more young people and to invest in them, besides the funding, because there is, some money that needs to be pumped in. But what other resources, or are you reaching out to them? Or are you letting them come to you? And also just touching on the startups and the SMMEs, because a lot of them are young people. So what's the strategy with us? What are you going to do to include us to grow and develop the continent? Thank you.
Fantastic. Perfect. We'll start with you and get responses from the rest
Very
of the panel.
Very quickly. So why don't you tell us what you want? Why is it that you say, hey, tell me what you do for me? Tell us what you want to develop this country. You are the future. So tell us what you need. But be careful, because you may get it.
Wonderful response between yourself and Martin, the young people in the room here, quite clearly. But let's get responses. Mambusi as well, you wanted to allude to some of the projects regarding the IDC, but go ahead, Kana.
I think also practically around youth, I think we've also got to change the way we bring youth into the kind of the opportunities and the workplace situation.
Very traditionalist. Go to
We're very so for
institution to get a
example,
qualification.
I'll just talk about our own practical experience as well. I mean, we got frustrated as Mackenzie around kind of everyone talks about this youth unemployment problem. How do you make youth employable? So we started a program called Generations in partnership with a few, USAID and a few other entities. We figured out, and in a way building on some of the lessons learned in Germany around vocational training and looking at real live, partnering companies, creating kind of training opportunities, giving people very quickly practical skills, not all the other stuff, but just practical skills so they can be employable. And what's been interesting in the 5 or 6 countries we worked in, Kenya being one, Mexico, India, Spain, and even the US, and we'd focus on different sectors. When we went through that program, we found that once they had finished, the employability rate was over 90%. So there's clearly, opportunities out there, and if we can figure out how to get the youth, give them that opportunity, there'll be a matchmaking, in a way. So I think, again, I like what Joe's saying, and I'm sorry, Richard, we are agreeing a bit on this. But, what is it that you need? No, you'll find youth, give us a chance to train, even for free. Give us a matchmaking opportunity. Maybe give us some funding. We're entrepreneurial. Africans are entrepreneurial. Give them those 3 things, and let's see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Martin?
As a fellow young person, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. That's actually not true. I'm not sure that formal education is providing the skills that we entirely need as we move into this thing called a new economy. I think it's always new, but the velocity of life and velocity of competitiveness, productivity in the workplace has increased dramatically in recent times and will continue to do so. I heard a nice stat in London last week. Deloitte hires a young person, i.e. a graduate or soon to graduate, every 8 minutes globally. Every 8 minutes. So I guess in the last hour or so, we've hired 7, 8 people, which is great, globally. But I think it's ultimately you want people not just to, you want to plug young people into the world of work that provides very rapid learning skills, of course, allows them to, and something I always say is there's no greater combination in life than having the experience of grey hair and the energy or the experience of old people and the energy of young combined. And I think in South Africa's case, we have almost a unique situation in South Africa. This is a lot of this issue, institutional memory, new enthusiasm, young skills, and how do we marry those two? I think that's a very powerful force for good and ultimate development that we need to embrace.
As we do wrap up with a concluding commentary, quite a bit has naturally been said about mindset, about unlocking funding, as well as skills development, which is an improved approach to the challenges that we have with infrastructure on the continent. But I want us to wrap it up by getting closing remarks from the panelists regarding elements and matters that we cannot compromise on as we look to see a tangible difference taking place when it comes to infrastructure development. Busi, let's start with you as we make our way down the panel.
I think the public sector has a duty to demonstrate that the funding that we are deploying, whether into infrastructure or anything else, is being deployed honestly and effectively and efficiently. The public is crying out to see that we are deploying their resources in a very honest and a very efficient manner. And I think perhaps that is a necessary condition for unlocking this partnership that will unlock those billions of dollars that are available for new infrastructure. So I'm excited for the future of this continent.
Ghana?
Yeah, I also think, I think over the last 5-10 years we've talked a lot. I think it's time for a bit of action. And in a way, like I know for us as Mackenzie, we've decided instead of we'll give the ideas out, but we'll try to figure out how we can show some examples. So I think our commitment is around youth employment. How can we create some examples, like in Kenya, around partnering the public, private and sector? How do we ourselves take some risk, work with the public and private sector and go after a few projects that show how partnerships can unlock funding? and physically be present in countries which are growing, rather than flying in from outside. Actually be there and work with the local community and build local skills.
True.
So I think that's our commitment, so that it's not just about giving advice, because I know advice is, but it's about also practically showing some action. I think that's what we need to move to as well.
Real action.
Yeah.
30
And not
seconds.
just wait for governments to do something.
Precisely, really taking action. Between Martin and Joe, 30 seconds.
I love Joe's example of the Egyptian story. I think that we need to see the emergence of both private sector, as we said, public sector, champions of key infrastructure projects. If you have a leader and a backer of that project, ultimately it'll happen in a committed fashion.
Joe?
I would say let's make a plan, execute on it, and show people the way by example, and it'll be fine.
Indeed. We'll leave it on that powerful note, clearly ensuring that we find a way forward. There's a common vision, inclusive partnerships, and of course skills development and honest and efficient allocation of capital that is funded. Then maybe we'll build just more than pyramids, right, Joe? Building up on your Egypt example.
Absolutely.
A big thank you to our audience members for asking questions and participating with us today over the last hour. And of course, my panelists for this conversation, Joe Kaiser, President and CEO of Siemens, Dr. Martin Davies, Managing Director for Emerging Markets in Africa at Deloitte, Kanan Lakmiharan, Partner and Head of Infrastructure Practice at McKinsey & Company, and Musi Mabuza, Board Chairperson at the Industrial Development Corporation. From myself, Kukule Tucela, and the team, that's where we'll leave it for today, but you can continue giving us insight on social media as the conversation will continue online. For now, though, it's goodbye.